Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of AP3 Advisory, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's PPP Masterclass webinar, theme From Potential to Impact, and institutional capacity and skills required to deliver bankable PPPs in Africa. We are honored to be joined by senior leaders, policymakers, and practitioners from across Africa. Your presence affirms the importance of strengthening the institutional system, technical skills, and governance framework that turn PPP ambition into projects that are truly bankable, financeable, and sustainable. This masterclass is designed to be practical and peer-driven, a space to interrogate what works, share lessons, and equip ourselves to build PPP pipeline that investors trust and citizens value. It is my honor now to introduce our moderator, Dr. Gori Olusina Daniel, a seasoned expert on public-private partnership, whose leadership and experience will guide us through today's discussion. Dr. Gori, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us. The PPP Masterclass remains AP3's commitment to building a community of practice across Africa, from the public sector, from the private sector, people who every day are answering the difficult question of what needs to be done to address the significant infrastructure gap in Africa. Central to that are PPP units. These are government departments that are central to originating, conceptualizing, planning, and implementing PPPs. So this conversation is particularly relevant to them, but also to the ecosystem of PPP practitioners from across the public and private sector, but also DFIs who are invested in increasing the pipeline of PPP projects, well-prepared PPP projects that hit the markets. I'm joined today by a stellar expert panel. I can see Barrister Ajibola. I can see David. I think we're expecting one other participant, one other panelist. But before that, let me set some context and then we will dive right in. What we have today is about 15 minutes or so where we are working through this important topic. We will then be opening up, as part of that, we'll be opening on to questions, because this is a topic where clearly there's a great deal of interest. We're joined by participants from 11 different countries, 8 of which are in Africa. So we are very, very pleased to welcome such a distinguished audience of participants to this webinar. Now, we know the numbers. We know that there's a significant shortfall in terms of the infrastructure deficit across Africa. We also, because we're part of this community, understand the important place and role that public-private partnerships play. But what is interesting is that based on some empirical reviews, most of the PPP activity across the region is concentrated in 5 different countries. So we're talking South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco, and Ghana. But more interestingly, only a fraction of projects that are initiated ever really see the light of day. Central to this conversation is not just the question of private sector interest. And I think the key point that our experts will make is that there's no shortage of private sector interest in good projects, in good environments. The issue is, what does that environment look like that attracts, sustains, and causes projects to be able to be delivered effectively? So our central question today is from potential to impact, the institutional capacity and skills required to deliver bankable PPP questions. By bankable PPP projects in Africa, forgive me. And I will be moderating this session, asking our panelists, drawing from their experience, what they think this is and how to go beyond just, perhaps a menu of technical expertise to a whole system approach to what it takes to conceptualize, develop, and implement PPPs. So joining me on this panel, in no specific order, is David Wright. He's an associate director with AP3 in our PPP transaction services team. Following a distinguished career as a senior British civil servant in the 1990s, over the last 30 years, David has built a reputation as a leading senior infrastructure finance and PPP transaction specialist. He has significant expertise in planning and structuring PPPs for value and impact, advising and training government officials and private sector officials in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Caribbean on efficient PPP program management and infrastructure delivery. David also contributes to PPP research and shares best practice globally. As a senior infrastructure finance PPP advisor on the FCDO-funded UK-Nigeria Infrastructure Advisory Facility, David has played a key role in the development and delivery of a £7.2 billion pipeline of climate-smart projects across a number of sectors, including transport, renewable energy, agro-industrial processing park, and sustainable housing. David currently serves as an advisory board member of the National Center of Privatization and PPPs for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and has previously served in senior advisory capacity for governments of Jamaica, Tobago, and the Caribbean Development Bank. His extensive experience includes managing complex projects and leading teams to identify commercial solutions for socially and economically beneficial projects. Thank you for joining us this morning, David. Good morning.
Good morning.
We also are privileged to have Barrister Akinmade, Ajibola, partner at AP3 Advisory and a legal practitioner. Barrister Ajibola has over 25 years as a legal practitioner at the Barr and deep expertise in corporate and commercial law, tax litigation and advisory, infrastructure law, and public-private partnership transaction advisory. With more than 15 years of experience in PPPs, he has advised governments and private sector clients on infrastructure procurement, regulatory frameworks, and project finance across Nigeria and Africa. He currently serves as AP3's commercial director, managing the relationship with the UK NIAF program, a £72.8 million UK FCDO-funded initiative supporting Nigeria's transition to planning and implementation of climate-smart infrastructure development since 2019. Barrister Akin has also served in key national roles, including as a member of the Infrastructure Working Group for Nigeria's Medium-Term National Development Plan 2021 to 2025, and Infrastructure Thematic Lead for NASBA, that is a National Assembly Business Economic Roundtable hosted by the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Formerly the chairman of the Tax Appeal Tribunal, Southwest Zone. He's a recognized authority in tax education and serves on the board of the International Association of Tax Judges. Barrister Akin is also a capital markets qualified solicitor, senior lecturer, published author, and member of several professional bodies, including the NESG, MBA, IBA, CLA, and AIA. Maybe he'll explain those acronyms when he speaks. Barrister Akin joins us from Lagos. Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Last but not least, we are joined by Noma Nkomani. Noma is a development practitioner and PPP specialist based in Harare, Zimbabwe, with over 20 years of cross-sectorial experience spanning audit, financial management, business development, management consulting, Noma is a seasoned development practitioner committed to driving inclusive and sustainable growth through innovative financing mechanisms. She is a registered public accountant and public auditor with the Public Accountants and Auditors Board of Zimbabwe, and a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants and of Zimbabwe. Noma has worked across diverse sectors, including financial services, government agencies, healthcare, manufacturing, and NGOs, bringing a people-centered and system-thinking approach to infrastructure and development initiatives. She was among the early pioneers of public-private partnerships in Zimbabwe, having led several World Bank and African Development Bank funded capacity building programs that laid the groundwork for institutionalizing PPP frameworks in the country and much of Southern Africa. She's a passionate advocate for sustainability. Noma has also played a leading role in mainstreaming sustainability reporting in Zimbabwe, serving on and chairing the Technical Committee on Sustainability Reporting under the Business Council for Sustainable Development in Zimbabwe. Once again, Noma joins us from Harare. Good morning. Probably good afternoon in Harare, actually. It's probably
Yes.
afternoon. So good afternoon to you, Noma.
Afternoon, everyone.
Awesome. Now, as I said, we're going to start off by each of our expert panelists setting out their thoughts. Today, we are looking at the institutional capacity and skills required to deliver PPP, bankable PPPs in Africa. David, you spent over 30 years shaping the PPP landscape and environment, initially in the UK and since then globally. Would you mind kicking us off and sharing your thoughts and reflections on this important topic?
Well, thank you very much, Gori. Well, having been introduced in that way, I actually feel quite ashamed. Because if I've taken such a leading part in this, am I therefore responsible for the fact there are so few successful projects? I wonder. Well, when we speak of, you mentioned this strange word, bankability in PPPs, I really think that the main issue is a lack of predictability and, quite frankly, a lack of credibility in virtually all of the players in this particular game. I think we all know that a project will only be bankable when there are certain fundamentals in place. It is like building a house. Are you building a house on sand or not? What are these fundamentals? I believe, obviously, a clear legal and regulatory framework, because we're talking about contracts here, we're talking about public money, etc. Contracts that are not only fit for purpose, but are actually enforceable in practice. That hackneyed phrase, transparent procurement, which quite frankly I don't believe exists anywhere, but never mind. And perhaps most importantly, certainly very importantly, public institutions, whether those be ministries, departments, agencies, parastatal, whatever, with the capacity to manage the complete PPP cycle, not just the procurement, but what is often forgotten about, contract management, which might well be for 10, 15, 25, 30 years. And at the end of the contract, handback. So without these foundations, even the best structured project is almost guaranteed to fail to attract capital, which it needs. And I believe that Africa's challenge is not the lack of ideas. I think those are well understood, but the gap between design and execution. What undermines otherwise strong proposals? Political risk, of course, currency volatility, and weak institutions. And by contrast, in more mature markets, nothing's perfect there either. At least we have standardization, deep capital markets, and possibly something that doesn't yet exist in much of Africa, a program-based approach to make transactions both quicker and more reliable. And what I've seen, whether through the UK NIAF pipeline in Nigeria, my work in the Caribbean, or my role in Saudi Arabia, is that confidence builds where governments invest in institutional strength and policy continuity. And I say invest in, this costs money, but it should not be regarded as a cost. It's an investment in a process. So for me, the lesson's simple. Bankability is not just about financing techniques. It's about creating systems, not isolated transactions, consistency, not one-off promises, and capacity that grows through live experience, not only through training, action learning. And those are the conditions under which I believe PPPs might be able to deliver value and, most importantly, impact on the intended beneficiaries. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Quite a lot there. I love how you have straight off the bat introduced this whole idea of a transition from isolated projects to taking a program-based approach. These are concepts that you have shared very, very widely, even on the UK NIAF program in Nigeria, and I'm sure it reflects in some of the work that you've done, not just in Saudi Arabia and the Caribbean, but also work that I know that you're doing in Kenya. Barrister Akin, let me move to you. You are a legal professional, and over the last 25 to 30 years, and on the back of that, you would be very well acquainted with the importance of a very strong legal and regulatory framework. This is not the point where I present to you pointed questions. This is your opening statement. Be interested in your opening reflections on this issue of the sort of capabilities and institutional capacity that's required to deliver bankable PPPs across Africa. The floor is yours, Barrister Akin. You are. Would you like to unmute? Yes.
Thank you, and good morning, all. Well, let me say that in the few years that I've been involved in PPPs, and I'll try not to make it technical at all. Maybe I should just bring it down to simple language. A number of things have resonated with me as nuggets that I think, whether procuring authority, whether private entity proposing, whether transaction advisors, all those who are within the PPP procurement ecosystem should hold dear. These nuggets include that we learn by doing. Most of the times, a lot of the concerns and fears around how PPPs should be structured, or a lot of the mistakes that happen is as a result of insufficient practice, insufficient involvement, and insufficient learning from past experiences. You'll be surprised at how much intellectual property and how much learning and resources is within our institutions and establishments from PPP contracts, either that have been successful or that have failed. I always say that there's sufficient learning in those that are successful as much as there is in those that have failed. So we learn by doing. Copying and pasting is really not a crime, as long as you are able to make appropriate modifications to suit circumstances. If you see experiences and transactions that have become successful, then really just look at the key elements that made those transactions successful, and try and follow the approaches that made those transactions successful. Being able to identify what is important and what is key is also crucial. Ask for help when you don't know how. This is what I tell the procuring authorities and the institutions when you are going about determining whether you should embark on a project or the other. The expertise will not necessarily be resident within your existing resources in that institution. It's important at a very early stage to look out to bringing in transaction advisors that can assist you and hold your hand if needed. You won't have every capacity installed within your offices, be it technical, be it financial, be it legal, or whatever have you. Procuring authorities also would know that there is a multidisciplinary involvement in any PPP transaction, which means that when you look at where you have deficiencies, you need to reach out for help. PPP transactions, those contracts usually are for a tenure that can go up to 15, 20, 25 years, or even more in some instances. Things will change, including yourself. Your perspective and your view on things will change. Macroeconomic circumstances will change. The ability to perform, or the ability to realize some of the aspirations will change. So you need to always build that into the transaction. How do you go about dealing with changes in law? How do you go about with detailed MAC clauses, material adverse change clauses that pick out specific instances for review and renegotiation, but does not allow for opportunistic renegotiation. So things will change. I think that's always important. Money is not everything in the design of PPPs. Yes, people want to make commercial and financial benefit. However, that's not the only thing that you should look out for a PPP to be successful. You need to bring all stakeholders, carry them along, look at community impact, look at social impact, look at win-win type provisions in your contract, not trying to have one over. When I hear of some of the contracts that have come up for review or that have been revised from when they were initially negotiated and signed, oftentimes it's because one person has tried to take perhaps undue advantage where they found the opportunity, rather than try and create a balanced contractual exchange. If you think you are smart, somebody smarter is coming. At the end of the day, things will always continue to be interplayed during the contract management process. So there will be continuous interaction. And if you bury dead bodies, somebody will unearth it, and it will cause a problem in future. Disputes are a fact of life. Deal with it. They would always happen. It's human nature. It's human interaction. So building in proper dispute resolution mechanisms at a very early stage, multi-layered dispute resolution mechanisms, maybe starting from negotiation within the counterparties, before you move to mediation, before you move to arbitration, having those kind of tiered and layered approaches is also very key and important. And lastly, continuous communication, like in marriages, it helps. Continuous exchange of information and developments between counterparties help people to understand exactly what's going on and deal with issues before they arise. So I think in plain and simple language, these are some of the key nuggets that I think I would bring out of the few years that I have been involved in PPP and things that have resonated with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Barrister Aki. I know our Our participants will hear you loud and clear on the issue of disputes, the absence of effective dispute resolution mechanisms being a real issue across the continent. But I think one thing I do take that sums up, at least in my mind, what you're saying is this idea of understanding from a skills and competency point of view, the importance of taking a partnership orientation in the design, development, and implementation and management of PPPs. We may well go back to that theme as we dive more deeply into the discussion. Noma, let's come to you. You come at this from a financial point of view, but also as one of the pioneers in terms of recognizing the importance of building institutional capacity in your home country of Zimbabwe, but also having delivered similar projects across Southern Africa over the last 15 to 20 years. Let's hear from you. What are your sort of key reflections on the competencies and capacities required to improve the delivery of bankable PPP projects across the continent?
Morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity just to share on some of my experiences. True to form, I'm an accountant, so I don't really have as many words to share. But when I just look at looking at PPPs, looking at the institutional capacities required to deliver on PPP projects, the one thing that I always reflect on is our fundamental economic problem, which is known as scarcity, which is the conflict that arises between unlimited human wants and limited resources. When I look at it from a perspective of infrastructure, and also just coming from Zim, where we just have a lot that we need to develop in the infrastructure space, but we are very limited in the resources that we have to actually deliver in infrastructure or deliver the infrastructure requirements of the nation. We come to a place where we need to make choices in terms of the things that we can deliver on and what we can't deliver on. And even as looking from an investor's perspective, the investor also needs to make choices on what they can invest in and what they won't invest in. I've often found, like, as I'm just looking at people and them talking about projects that they have for implementation or projects that require financing, that the project preparation is not often it's not adequate, it's not compelling, it's not enough to justify or to convince an investor of the need of making an investment. So I think that if projects were to do a lot more in the project preparation phase, we will be able to see an increase in the investments made in PPPs. So yeah, so I think for me, just project preparation, and the rest my colleagues have actually given some thoughts on.
Thank you, Noma. Project preparation, everyone hinges conversations around this being a key capability that is required, and I believe in your response you would have recognized beyond finance that there are competencies, technical, commercial, environmental, as well as an understanding of the sort of social governance issues that are critical to ensuring that projects meet not just lender requirements, but are able to be structured in such a way that they can overcome any sort of stakeholder opposition associated, particularly with large infrastructure projects. David, might I bring you back into the conversation? In your opening statements, you talked about Africa's challenge being the gap between design and execution. So you're talking about your let me not assume what you're talking about. Please, can you elaborate on that? What is this gap? And more importantly, given our subject today, how do we plug it?
Okay, Gori, I'm not sure I'll be able to answer the second question. The point I was making about the challenge being execution and not ideas, I hear on the one hand, there's plenty of money for projects in Africa. Lots of people have lots of money. They want to invest in good projects. Africa seems like a good place, except it isn't. So what needs to be changed? I mentioned political risk. Now, this is present in every country in which I've worked, from democracies to authoritarian states, to states that have just emerged from the collapse of communism and the destruction of the Berlin Wall. I worked in a number of recently freed countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I worked in places like Azerbaijan, where you have an autocratic dictator who does appear to have the best interests of his people at heart. I even worked in a very small part of Africa where there was a king, and indeed is a king, and speaking with his advisor, trying to see how PPP could work there. And I concluded that when one person owns 98% of the GDP in a jurisdiction, if you're talking about PPP, the conversation goes something like, well, if you're going to give contracts to your cousins to build things, then at least make sure that you tell them if they fail to deliver, that's the last contract they get for another 5 years. And what this is, I'm trying to get to, political risk for long-term contracts is a problem that is very difficult to solve. Politicians want things done now, preferably, or at the very least, before they begin their next election campaign. Well, that doesn't fit with Noma's idea of spending a lot of time making sure you prepare your projects properly. Because they're going to be saying all the time, when's this project going to come out? When am I going to be able to cut this ribbon? When am I going to get my photograph in the papers? So political risk, PPP is not necessarily a bipartisan policy. Generally speaking, in Africa, when there is a change of government, there's a period of time when the incoming government tries to stop everything that was being done by the previous government and at least review it. That does not encourage anybody in the process. Is it necessary? Maybe. I don't know. It is a problem, political risk. And of course, within that heading are many other risks as well. Currency volatility is a problem. If you're getting investment from outside the country, then typically the return ought to be in the currency of that investment. If it's not, who's going to take that currency volatility risk? There are tools available that can help to mitigate that risk, but it's just something else to think about. If you're developing a, I don't know, student accommodation, social housing type project, when the rents are in the local currency, that might not be good enough to ensure the necessary return. But it's weak institutions that is probably the major contributor to this gap between ideas and execution. And it doesn't matter at what level of government. I have worked for Kenya counties who've been given lots and lots of responsibilities, but no resources. So they can't even pay to have their capacity improved. There's no real recognition that in order to prepare a project properly, And very few countries in the world actually think about having a project preparation fund, right? There are some. And that fund is typically used for the employment of external advisors. And the first thing I've said to those governments is, can you use that fund to ensure that the people in the contracting authority know what they're doing? Because if it doesn't, all you're going to be doing is getting the cheapest consultants who are probably worse than you employing your own people to do it. So mature markets rely upon, as I said earlier, program models. Pick a sector, make sure that you do several projects in that sector, getting the benefits of the efficiencies from scale, the efficiencies from learning, the efficiencies from copying and pasting. That's why when I started off doing this, I didn't just procure one prison. I was actually procuring 2 prisons at the same time. Now, I would say don't ever do that, please, because you end up wondering which project you're on when you're faced by people across the other side of the table. But as soon as I finished that, I was starting on the next one. I'd already learned lessons from that process. Then, unfortunately or fortunately, I was asked to go and do the same thing for schools, because the then Secretary of State for Education said, who's been getting these prisons built? Because as far as I'm concerned, schools are no different from prisons. You need to keep the right people in and the wrong people out. Okay, so I went off and started doing schools, which was much more satisfying, because in England, we've got tens of thousands of schools.
David, I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to jump in here for a second, because I do know that much of our audience, we have a number of mature PPP markets across the continent. Perhaps a handful, right? And and you may respond that may be relatively speaking, but the vast majority of our audience will be listening to you and saying, look, you've touched on a really important point. There is a significant gap between design and the execution capabilities. You've outlined that in a way that I don't think anyone can contest. But our participants would be really keen on hearing a response to my second question. How do you plug the gap? Now, you touched a little bit on that by talking about a project preparation facility, but I want to bring Barrister Akin in for a second, while I give you a little bit more time to think and to be part of this conversation, David. I don't want to get David. I think David needs to be part of this conversation as well. So let's not get rid of David, but let's get Akin in. David has touched on this issue of weak institutions, and I don't know how many of our participants he has lost. I don't know how many friends he has made, right, in making that statement. So, we need you, not necessarily to disagree, because I don't think you do, but let's touch on what we need to know. How do we face the issue of political risk, weak institutions? How do we face it head on? Because it was David himself that mentioned that confidence builds when governments invest in institutional strength. So based on your experience, what are your thoughts and reflections and advice on how to strengthen the institutions that underpin the delivery of PPPs?
Thank you. David said many things. He made us aware through his experiences that he procured prisons under PPP, schools under PPP. That shows us the breadth of opportunities that exist in terms of public services, public utilities that can be procured by PPP anywhere in the world. He also said that from his experience, procuring PPPs for prisons and schools were no different, or perhaps he said prisons and schools were no different. This takes me back to the comment attributed to Kemi Badenoch in the UK recently when she spoke of her schooling experience in Nigeria and said it was like a prison. And I hope that's not what David is referring to. But coming back to the question, I think what is important, the important starting point is to have a robust governance framework, a strong legal framework. I think about 33 out of 54 countries in Africa now have a dedicated PPP law. So it is always important when you elevate PPP procurement to the point where you have specific, detailed legislation that deals with PPP procurement end to end. You will remember, however, that PPP procurement, like I said, is a process, but it also would involve different sectors. So it's not as if one law will deal with all the aspects that are involved in a typical transaction. You would also need sectoral legislation that speaks to the PPP procurement legislation. And there's a proper handshake, there's a proper calibration of how they work together. So that if you want to procure PPP in a particular sector, if you look at the PPP procurement law that governs the procedural and the regulatory aspect, you would also be able to work with the subject matter legislation or the sectoral legislation that deals with that particular area. So the starting point is always having a proper law that distinguishes the institutions that will regulate or oversight or facilitate PPP procurement in one way or another. This gives the procuring authorities a direction and a clear path in terms of the process. This also makes it easy for private sector proponents to know what exactly it is that is required. Where do they need to go? Who do they need to talk to? What do they need to have? What should they have done or not done in order to make the criteria requirements? Then coming below that is where you now look at the PPP contract, which is the governing Bible at the end of the day. It is, of course, always subject to the dictates of the PPP laws or the extant laws within that particular country. So, like I said, you would have the PPP procurement law, you'd have the sectoral law, you'd have cross-cutting legislations like tax legislations that also have an impact. You must be able to have a clear connection within these legislations. And I think that's the work of your legal advisors in terms of being able to interpret the import of these legislations and assist you to ensure that all the connectivity, all the areas of dependency are identified. Coming back to the PPP contract, there are certain critical elements that I think the institutions that are regulating PPPs need to insist that will be found in any typical PPP contract. The concession, it must be clear in scope. It must be clear in duration. What exactly is it trying to deal with? Oftentimes, there are ambiguities that lead to disputes. We have examples, even here in Nigeria. The performance standards, the service obligations, the KPIs, how do you measure them? How do you determine availability, safety issues, quality issues? All these need to be specified. Maintenance issues, all these need to be specified. Then, of course, like I said earlier, it must be a balanced document. You need to have public interest safeguards, and you ensure that the private sector proponent adheres to these public interest safeguards to ensure that the users get the benefit that is intended. Termination issues, you need to determine the conditions under which government can terminate or under which government can step in, as the case may be. Reversionary clauses, assets must revert in good conditions. You find many situations where the useful life of the asset has really been dissipated as at the time when the reversion happens. So these issues are very, very key. Assets must be free from liens, from encumbrances. You don't want a situation where the private sector proponent has leveraged the asset to the hilt, and at the end of the day, it's really unclear whether there's still any ownership or any benefit in the ownership left in the reversion. So these issues are critical when you are regulating PPP contracts, when the procuring institutions are bringing these agreements to you for review. You must also understand how renegotiation frameworks are built into these contracts. What are your trigger events? What will determine material adverse changes? What will determine force majeure? Like David said, you find typical examples, very common here in Nigeria, and I'm always keen when I see PPPs that survive successive governments. It's very common here. When one government goes and another one comes in, all of a sudden, all the agreements signed by the previous government is either up for review, for renegotiation, or sometimes they are thrown out. So these mechanisms need to be factored into the PPP agreement. Unforeseeable changes in law. Look at what we've done recently. We've had a complete reform of our tax regime, a complete change of our tax laws. These aspects need to be reflected in order to determine how unforeseeable changes in law is dealt with. Oftentimes, you have what we call stabilization clauses, which will try to preserve the law at the time that the contract was made for the purpose of interpreting that contract rather than the law as it has changed. So such things are necessary in terms of the things that try to help us resolve these issues that make PPPs not survive or that make PPPs run into problems that are sometimes irretractable. And even if you're going to, sorry.
Thank you, Barrister Aki. I must jump in because I want to bring Noma in. I've got an eye on the time, and I'm also keen to get some questions in from the audience. But as I reflect, Barrister Akin, on what you have just shared with us in response to David, you are saying that you've emphasized the importance of PPP law, recognize that 33 out of 54 countries have that. You have gone in some degree of depth on the role that law plays in terms of providing procedural and sectorial guidelines for PPPs. But you have doubled down I don't know, I know you haven't had enough time, but I think you've covered a lot of ground on the importance of the contract. You've emphasized the role of legal advisors. And as I listen to you, you have talked about, that contract capturing matters regarding the scope and duration of a concession, which as legal advisors, you will be relying on technical experts to determine what that looks like, technical and financial experts to determine what that looks like. You're looking at performance standards, where you would be looking, again, relying on technical and commercial experts to determine what those standards look like. But you've also talked about, again, this idea of having a balanced contract that recognizes this partnership orientation that you've talked about. Now, David, going back to David, I'm bringing back into the conversation. He emphasized, as you did, the importance of external advisors. But I'm hoping that Noma can talk to us about the capabilities that PPP units, contracting authorities need to have, right? Because it's one thing to be able to rely on people like yourselves and people like David, but there is institutional capacity that needs to be built to ensure that the right projects are picked, and to ensure that, you know, long after a project is concluded, it is well managed going forward. So Noma, from your experience of institutionalizing PPP frameworks in Zimbabwe, what would you say are the steps governments can take to ensure that lasting PPP capability is built in public institutions?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, and just for the inputs from the other members of the panel. So I think it's a really great question because, as you say, Gori, government's role and responsibility is not just to deliver on one assignment, but also just to be able to ensure that there will be several PPPs that institutions can deliver on or in for decades to come. So when I look at this, I would say that there's probably 6 things that you need to be able to deliver that institutional capacity to deliver on PPP assignments. And I can definitely attest to the benefit of having those things in place. Because when I look at the Zimbabwe example, where we had a Joint Ventures Act, which was enacted in 2013, and then we worked together with the AP3 team on coming up with the manuals and the regulations that support that act between 2015 and between 2015 and 2017. And there's a few things that I can pick out from that. And the first is that governments should create an enabling environment, which is laws, policies, and institutions. In the case of Zimbabwe, because that's the place that I know best, like I said, we had the Joint Ventures Act, but we also came in to come up with the manuals and the regulations for PPPs. And this was done under the then Joint Ventures Unit, and this is now currently being managed under ZEDA. There's actually a section that looks at PPPs. So when we look at establishing a clear policy and legal framework, we need to make sure that we define why and how PPPs are used. And it's not just a case of saying, well, we don't have money, so therefore let's go for PPPs, but there must be a clear justification as to when we get into PPPs. I mentioned the legislation already, that we need to enact laws that standardize the processes when we look at procurement processes, risk allocation, contract management, and ensure that there's legal certainty for investors. We also need standardized guidelines where we develop model contracts, procurement rules, appraisal methodologies that will ensure consistency. The second thing that we'll need to do to ensure that we have lasting PPPs is to create institutional structures and dedicated units. Examples of these are PPP units or centers of expertise, where we've got people who come in and their speciality actually just comes into looking at PPPs. When I look at when we started the PPP journey together in 2015, you could literally pick at the number of PPP projects or PPPs that were being executed in the country. But at last count, I think end of 2024, ZEDA reported that they had 46 PPP projects that were under consideration. And in the first quarter of 2025, they were looking at another 16. So that's quite a big jump in terms of, and it actually shows the effects of creating institutional structures and dedicated units. And another point one would want to consider when you look at institutional structures and creating dedicated units to PPPs is you need to train sector ministries and agencies to identify, prepare, and manage PPP projects with support from a central PPP unit. Because there's no point, you actually find that the central unit would actually become overwhelmed with things that they need to look at and to prepare and to manage as PPP projects if the line ministries that or agencies that are supposed to that are actually in charge of the project identification and project preparation are not adequately resourced. They will need a coordination mechanisms where we align PPPs with public investment planning and budgeting. Another thing that we'll need, or a pillar towards creating the institutional capacity, is to develop human and technical capacity. So in this, we look at skills development, where public officials are trained in project finance, risk management, contract negotiation, and monitoring, and knowledge transfer. And I think we did speak about this. And when I look at the Zim example as well, African Development Bank, apart from funding the development of the manuals and the regulations in Zimbabwe, they also they also funded training of public officials. I think there must have been a few hundred that were trained at the time on project finance, risk management, and contract negotiation and monitoring. Then we also need knowledge transfer. And I think this is something which we didn't do as much as we would need to do so that we get to where we want to get to in terms of development of bankable projects or execution on bankable PPP projects. That it's good to work with external advisors, but you don't want them to just do the work. You actually want there to be a skills transfer as you're working with these external advisors, so that in future, like ministries and other entities are actually better equipped to deliver on these practices, on these projects. And then the final thing that you can consider when we're looking at human and capacity development is committees of practice, where you have networks across ministries and regions, and even looking at international players so that you can just share lessons learned. And I think we would all benefit quite a bit in creating like communities of practices on PPPs. And these are some of the things, but we need to engage a lot more in conversations of this nature. The fourth pillar, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Noma, if you can give us the fourth pillar, and then we will hear from David and Akin as we close.
Okay, so the fourth pillar will be on financial and risk management systems that we spoke about this earlier on, establishment of funds to finance feasibility studies and structuring so that we avoid reliance on private partners for early designing, and creating transparent processes and systems so we report contingent liabilities, guarantees, and long-term commitments, and affordability and value for money tests, where we need to institutionalize tools to evaluate if PPPs are fiscally sustainable and truly more efficient than public procurement. And we spoke earlier on about transparency and accountability that needs to increase. And a very important thing, which I think we could all build on, is to build a sustainable project pipeline so that we just link PPP pipelines to national infrastructure development plans. Yeah. So in short, we need, yeah.
Thank you, Noma. I'm just mindful of time, but clearly there's so much in there that we're still to share. This webinar is it precludes the in-person 5-day PPP Masterclass taking place in Abuja from the 6th to the 10th of October, and I'm sure that will provide ample time to get through some of the detail we've not been able to cover on this webinar. We have, however, done quite a lot. We have a couple of questions that are on the chat. We'll take one or two of those, and then I will have closing remarks from you all. But one of the key reflection that I'm taking from this exercise before we go into the questions is that you have all in different ways highlighted that the vast array of skills and competencies required, not just around procuring projects, but across the entire project lifecycle. You've talked about the sort of enabling environment that is required, the sort of legal protections to address some of the execution capabilities that David talked about that highlight the gap between the potential and the potential impact. And we've gone some way, all of you have gone some way in talking about how to bridge that execution gap in terms of better prepared projects, well-defined contracts that establish a partnership orientation that recognizes that a lot will change over the course of the concession environment, and it's important to drive for win-win-win, not just for the public sector party, not just for the private sector party, but ultimately for citizens. So as we think about your final parting shots and comments, I do want us to take one question, and this is directed to David. This is from Enie Ogbebo, and she asks, given that most PPP contracts would eventually revert to the public sector party at the end of the contract term, what approach or strategies should public sector adopt in readiness to take over the operation of the assets, including subcontracting considerations at the end of the contract term? Can you give us your thoughts on that, and with that, your final remarks?
Well, my one thought on that point is there's an awful lot of material that's been produced by the UK government on doing this. And I think the best thing for me to promise through AP3 is to provide links to the various documents. So, because otherwise, what I'm like, Gori, I'll spend the next 15 minutes explaining all the complexities of doing this and all the things I did that were wrong. And I don't mind admitting that I've done things wrong. So I guarantee to provide that to AP3, who can then send that on to those people who want to prepare for that. It's good to hear. I just got a series of essentially headline points I want to make to encapsulate my thoughts as a result of listening to other people. Bankability has to be built on predictability and credibility, right? As a sort of summary at a high level. When I've mentioned about I see Africa's challenges execution, not ideas. I'm not going to repeat any details. Nobody's really mentioned about viability gap funds. If you have one, it should be there to bridge viability and not to subsidize profit, which actually goes to how you deal with the second question that somebody asked. We've not really talked about investor sentiment in Africa. It is cautious. Appetite is there, but for well-structured and well-considered projects only. I have got a lot of different experiences of PPPs, working for the private sector and for the public sector, and for multilateral organizations. Program design matters more than one-off deals. Unfortunately, politicians are looking for one-off deals. I want the highway from the airport to town. I want this, huge projects. Absolute nonsense, but that's the political world in which we live. Program design, whether it be advising the government on their program to improve education for girls in Egypt 10 years ago, whether it's all sorts of examples I've got, those are much more likely to be successful in terms of impact. The Indian Highways model, for example. Shortening transaction timelines, standardization, and something again you haven't mentioned, engaging lenders early. So that if you can do it, lessons from Jamaica and the Caribbean, the ones I can talk about publicly, are building systems and not just transactions. So if you've got a PPP unit, what is its business plan? What is its vision on behalf of citizens? How is it going to move us from where we are today to where we want to be? How does that all connect up with the Vision 2030s, Sustainable Development Goals, and so on? Get rid of inconsistency and poor regulations. Continuity across political cycles ought to be non-negotiable. How do you do that? I don't know. And finally, capacity building for PPP managers. This wonderful subject. Thank you, Barrister Akin, for saying you learn by doing. Absolutely. The problem is, I mean, my most successful capacity building exercises have been where the participants actually have a live piece of work to do on a PPP project. And over 4 days, by a combination of cunning by me, group work and homework, at the end of those 4 days, their managers say to me, how on earth has so-and-so got to this point? They've produced a draft document. It's been sitting on their desk for 6 months. They come to your workshop and there's a draft. Well, let's ask them, not me. So workshops help, but things like embedding advisors in the organization, if that can be done, live project exposure. And I don't know, this happens in some places, sort of long-term hubs to build real capability. I think, Noma, you were talking about something that I think is like that. The problem is, and this is my very last comment, out of 100 so-called PP advisors, you'll be lucky to find, let's be generous, 5 who will actually be able to help you.
On that note, David, I think we should give Aki the last word on this. Barrister Aki, we've overrun a little bit, but we want to conclude with perhaps your reflections after listening to what David and Noma have said and what you've shared. What do you want to leave with our participants as we close?
Good news and good news only. And I'm happy that this session is only just a precursor to the proposed PPP masterclass, where probably there'll be more time to go in depth into some of the things that we have discussed. But I think bringing it back home, we really should all practitioners in this space should be awake to the opportunities. There's going to be a lot more PPP activity in Nigeria. There's going to be a lot more projects coming out, especially since the recent issuance of a framework by the federal government that now enables the ICRC to approve PPPs below a certain threshold. So below 20 billion, now the ICRC can approve your PPP without taking it to the Federal Executive Council, which means things will be moving pretty much quicker, and a lot of smaller PPP projects will come out of that. In fact, the regulations also allow the institutions themselves, the MDAs, procuring institutions like MDAs, to approve PPPs below 10 billion. So even some of these PPPs will be done by the agencies without coming to the ICRC for approval. Of course, the ICRC will still regulate, but it means that a lot more PPPs are going to happen. Some caveats, though, have been given in terms of the nature or the criteria, because when you open up the gates in this particular manner, you will find the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I think the ICRC has said that there will be no financial guarantees by government, no commitments from the federal treasury on these sort of PPPs, and they're going to give us specific guidelines on how these new threshold of PPPs will be procured. So I think it's good news for practitioners. It's good news for the sector generally. And that's why I said everyone should really be more awake to the opportunities that are presented. Gather up your skills, gather up your knowledge, beef up your institutional capacity within your MDAs. And yes, it's going to be interesting space looking forward from where we stand. Thank you.
And on that very upbeat note, I think all that remains is for us to thank our distinguished panelists, Noma Nkomani, David Wright, Barrister Ajibola. Thank you for taking the time out to speak with us. Thank you for sharing from your wealth of experience. And to our participants, thank you for spending your afternoon with us. We look forward to seeing you again on subsequent webinars and at the in-person PPP Masterclass taking place in Abuja between the 6th and the 10th of October. We'll end it here and look forward to engaging with you in the coming weeks and months. See you again soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Babu, akwai street a ciki?